Brandon from MindShift just dropped a video listing 100 insane things the Bible expects you to take literally, and it definitely deserves a response. Now, he went rapid fire, but I'll be breaking it down piece by piece over several videos. And this first response focuses on giants, hybrid beings, and mythical creatures. And before we jump in, real quick note, this isn't a personal attack on Brandon, and it's not apologetics either. I'm not here to defend dogma. I'm here to examine what the text actually says. Brandon's video is sarcastic, comedic, and even arrogant. Entertaining? Sure. But comedy isn't the same thing as real engagement with the text. And while it's easy to mock fundamentalism, let's be honest, that's a really low bar. The real question is, are the critiques fair in their actual literary and historical context? Brandon says he's reading carefully, but as we'll see, this simply is not the case. So let's see if his claims literally hold up. And one final note, the format of this video is going to be a clip from Brandon and then a response from me.
Let's look at all the things you, as a believer, 100% believe are literal from your Bible. We're talking ridiculous things. Hybrid beings and giants, fire-breathing monsters, talking animals, teleporting angels. Like, it's not me taking this insane book too literally. It's this insane book making insane literal claims that the Christian cherry picks for what is metaphor, what is poetic, what is allegory, and what is true or historic or meant to be taken literally. And you know how you can know they're not using any kind of good, consistent measurement?
Now, to be fair, Brandon is correct to state that there are plenty of Christians who do cherry pick in regards to interpretation, what should be literal, what should be metaphor, etc. However, what you're going to see in this video is that Brandon doesn't seem to have a consistent measurement either. Unless he is simply responding to claims that he has personally heard, it really feels like he's not engaging with any of the critical scholarship on any of the issues that I'm going to address in this video, and that he, in fact, is making the mistake of being the over-literalist due to a surface-level reading of the text.
The things that look good in our current society today are fine to be left literal, where the things that we have outgrown as a society are now metaphorical or even warnings to us about bad behavior. But a few hundred years ago, when these things were accepted as fine, the Bible was actually being used and taken literally to continue to endorse these things. We see that all throughout its history. So what's more likely, that your current interpretation of the Bible and what is literal is exactly as it was always meant to be? It just took 2,000 years to get to you and your proper understanding, or that all people for all time have taken this book and other holy books like this religion and other religions like it and warped it to meet them, their current state for what they want to accomplish, their definitions of right and wrong, how they want to utilize power, etc. I think we should be able to understand pretty soon.
Okay, this is going to be the only claim that doesn't deal with something directly in the text, but I want to point out that just because people throughout history have interpreted the biblical text in the way that Brandon described does not mean that is the case for every single person today. Yes, there are people that do that, but today we have more resources and tools that you could access in a lifetime. Logos Bible software alone has over 200,000 resources, not to mention all of the academic libraries and databases that are available to cover topics such as this. So yes, there are going to be people that have this view that the biblical text was written to a modern 21st century Western audience if we're talking about here in America. However, I don't know of a single person that actually accepts that view. Even the people that I know that we could categorize as fundamentalist do not hold to this view. They accept the biblical text as an ancient document and that we're not the original audience that the author had in mind. So if we're talking about the handful of people that actually still hold to this view, okay. But for everybody else, this really is not applicable. But let's get into the actual biblical text.
Let's talk about some of the crazy things in the Bible that are 100% meant to be taken literally. And my goal is to go really fast. We'll do some categories. Let's talk about giants and hybrid beings. Well, first we have to talk about the Nephilim. This is found in the first book of the Bible. Sons of God came down and raped daughters of man, because apparently God made angels with penises and a reproductive cycle. Even with his infinite foreknowledge, he never thought maybe I should just not do that so all these innocent women don't get raped and we don't get this half-breed that become giants, the Nephilim, that get so out of hand. That's one part of Christianity's excuse for why the flood had to happen. Don't worry, Brandon, you're always so silly using words like genocide. God just had to kill the half-breeds that he let. Yeah, much better. now.
All right, so as you can see, a healthy dose of sarcasm here. However, what's going on here, and this is going to be a common thread throughout virtually every single one of these critiques, is that Brandon is ignoring the original context for these verses. And I'm actually going to read the abstract of a paper. And this paper is by a scholar named Amar Anu. His paper is titled On the Origin of the Watchers. I'm going to link it in the description below. But here's what the abstract says. In the article, it is argued that the origin of the Watchers derives from the Mesopotamian mythology of the antediluvian sages, Apkallu. More precisely, it is proposed that the mythology of the Watchers and their sons, the giants, derived from inverted versions of various Mesopotamian myths and beliefs about Apkallu. On some layers of Mesopotamian mythology and ritual practices, the sages were already regarded as dangerous and potentially malicious creatures, upon which the Jewish authors could build their parody. Among other associations, the Apkallu had strong ties to Mesopotamian demonology, and they were occasionally counted as evil beings, capable of witchcraft. This shows that the wickedness of the antediluvian teachers of humankind in Jewish sources was not wholly an inversion of the Mesopotamian traditions by Jewish scholars, but was partly taken from already existing trends in Mesopotamian demonology. So in short, there was a context and a cultural backdrop for the Nephilim story that had roots in both demonology as well as the fact that these sages were in fact dangerous. There's also the Babylonian thought that Babylonian civilization had been given by the gods, that the Apkallu were the cultural heroes who possessed divine knowledge, and that Babylonian kings descended from the Apkallu. Whereas in biblical thought, there were giants pre and post-flood. Their offspring and knowledge were not of Yahweh, and they were the result of rebellion against Yahweh by lesser divine beings. So in other words, Babylon's boasting was actually the spread of corruption throughout humankind. And again, as the abstract of this paper stated, there were some layers of Mesopotamian mythology where the sages were already regarded as dangerous. I'm simply trying to provide both the positive and the negative side. And additionally, these verses within Genesis 6 also serve as somewhat of a timestamp within the text. So in other words, when an ancient reader came across this, they would know exactly which point in history was being referenced. And furthermore, this serves as a link between the genealogy of chapter 5, which ultimately concluded and built up to Noah, who was a man who was blameless before God. And then directly after this reference to the Nephilim is the flood narrative, where Noah is the main character and the hero of the biblical flood myth. One quick comment on the sons of God gesture that Brandon gave. This may seem strange to us, but we have to remember that we are a modern 21st century audience. We are not the original audience of the biblical text, and to an ancient Israelite, this fit right inside of their worldview. They would have known exactly what was going on when sons of God are referenced. And that is because the Old Testament has a three-tiered council structure like that at Ugarit. Yahweh is at the top. His family household, his sons of God, are next in hierarchy. They're tier 2. And then the lowest level, or tier 3, is reserved for the Elohim messengers. Elohim is a word that we often translate as God. However, it's best translated as a resident of the spiritual realm. And I've done several videos breaking down that concept as well. But these Elohim messengers, or malachim, is the word that we get for angels who are on the third tier. And malachim simply means messengers. It can refer to a divine messenger or a human messenger. It has to be determined within the context of the narrative or the passage which is being referred to. Now, regarding the infinite foreknowledge comment, this ignores the entire backdrop and context provided for the story, but regardless of that, this is a poor approach. It's virtually the exact same as why does God allow evil? This simply demonstrates that, according to the biblical text and biblical thought, the divine beings have free will just like humans. And Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is in fact the Bible describing a divine rebellion. There was also the angels with penises comment. And one, these aren't angels. They are sons of God. There is a difference. But aside from that, the biblical author isn't giving you an anatomy lesson on divine beings. In fact, if you look across the biblical text, the Bible is not a good anatomy book, because you will find things that match the worldview of the original audience, such as the kidneys being the seat of emotion. We know that's not the case today, but that's how they thought of it, and so it shows up in the text that way. But these last 2 points ignore the entire backdrop for all of this, which has been covered, but I'm going to summarize it here very quickly before moving on. The backdrop is the Mesopotamian Apkallu story. And the Apkallu were the wise men and cultural heroes of Mesopotamia who brought civilization to humans. And this is their explanation for why they are so great. Mesopotamia, but especially Babylon. The Apkallu are the key to understanding why Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is in the Bible. And that is because every point in the Genesis 6, 1 through 4 narrative has a counterpoint in the Mesopotamian Apkallu story. And so this is the biblical author demonizing this idea of greatness in Mesopotamian and Babylonian thought, because it is a rivaling and competing religion. This is an example of polemic literature. So in other words, what Babylon boasts of as great was actually an act of divine rebellion against God that resulted in the spread of corruption. And the Nephilim also appear in later Enochic literature as illegitimate teachers of humankind before the flood. Now, in the Apkallu story, the Apkallu are eventually sent to the underworld, the prison where the spirits of the fallen angels are kept. It's a chasm, and the authors of Peter and Jude in the New Testament pick up on this idea. And so the context for understanding Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is first and foremost the Mesopotamian material, then where it appears in the Old Testament, and then you have the Second Temple Jewish material, such as Enoch, which fills in our understanding, specifically things such as the punishment of the Apkallu. And then again in the New Testament where Peter and Jude pick up on the Enoch material. And so if we're going to have an honest conversation about the Nephilim, all of this needs to be taken into consideration. And so this is another example of imposing a modern 21st century Western cultural perspective on the biblical text rather than taking the Bible on its own terms. And if we want to seriously engage with the text, we have to take it on its own terms and within the fullness of the context that it came from. So as you can see, there's a huge backdrop to all of this, and we've only just scratched the surface, but it is enough to demonstrate that Brandon's explanation is overly simplistic and misses the entirety of the context of the Nephilim. All right, we're going to stick with giants, but let's move on.
A lot of people know about the Nephilim. Not a lot of people know about the distinction with other creatures like the Repam, the Anakim, the Emim, and the Zamzummim. I know those words sound crazy, but these are giant clans from Canaan. They have supernatural strength and size. There's a lot of distinctions there.
Okay, this one was a bit confusing to me because I'm not quite sure what distinctions Brandon is referring to between these quote-unquote creatures. And I'm also assuming that he means the Rephaim, not the Repam. And again, I'm not trying to pick on Brandon. I understand that nobody's going to pronounce everything perfect, myself included. But this is just one of those instances where I just don't feel like he's being careful, because if you read Deuteronomy 2, verse 11, and then verse 20, and then in chapter 3, 11, and verse 13, these texts inform the reader that the Anakim were considered Rephaim, and so were the Zamzummim. And Og of Bashan was left from the remnant of the Rephaim. And we'll get to Og more here in a moment. And then also Numbers 13 informs us that the Anakim were from the Nephilim. So again, what distinctions are we talking about here? If the Anakim were from the Nephilim and the Anakim were considered Rephaim and the Zamzummim and Og as well were considered Rephaim. There's also the Emim, which Brandon alluded to. And Deuteronomy chapter 2 actually states that the Emim were counted as Rephaim. So all of these various groups are referred to within the biblical text as Rephaim. And Brandon claimed that there was a lot of distinctions, but then he didn't provide any. And I'm not sure which distinctions he's talking about other than their geographical location of where they lived. But let's move on to the most famous giant within the biblical text, Goliath.
But we have Goliath, over 9 foot tall, taller than any human that we've actually been able to account for ever.
Now, Brandon is correct in stating that 9 feet tall is taller than any human being that has ever walked the earth. However, Brandon is making a crucial mistake in his assessment in this clip. And it's honestly hard to blame him because Brandon is basing his height off the Masoretic text reading of Goliath's height, which is roughly 9 foot 9 inches tall. But the Septuagint, as well as a document known as 4Q Sam A from the Dead Sea Scrolls Library, have Goliath's height at roughly 6 feet 9 inches tall. And these two documents, the Septuagint and 4Q Same, are regarded by virtually all scholars as the primary source material for Goliath's Height. You can see Emmanuel Tove's textual criticism, and I'll link some other articles below that dissect this even further. But 4Q Same dates to the 1st century BCE and predates the earliest Masoretic text manuscript by 1,000 years. And this reading of 6 foot 9 inches tall, or 4 cubits, is also attested by Josephus in the 1st century, as well as major codices such as Vaticanus and Alexandrinus. Now, to be clear, 6 foot 9 is still outrageously tall for someone back then, especially given that archaeological data suggests that the average height of a person, I think of a male, I'm going off memory here, was 5 feet to 5 feet 3 inches, somewhere in that range. So that is essentially the equivalent of LeBron James hanging out with someone that is 5 feet tall. There's a big difference there. However, this is getting wrapped up into the literalness of the text, because something is going on here with Goliath, and specifically the town in which Goliath is from. He is from the town of Gath. And if we read back to Joshua chapter 11, this is the end of the conquest narrative in Canaan. And this is what verses 21 through 22 state. And Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people in Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. Now, did you catch that? The conquest narrative ends with Anakim still left in the land, and some of these Anakim dwell in the land of Gath. So the fact that Goliath is described as a giant, and he is from a town where the Anakim were still left after the conquest, this is linking Goliath directly to the Anakim. And so what the author of 1 Samuel is doing here is informing you that David, the future king of Israel, is continuing this conquest. He is ridding the land of the remnant of the Anakim that were left after the conquest, because the conquest was not entirely successful. And there are still a remnant of people left from the supernatural rebellion against the Lord back from Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. And speaking of the conquest, I'm actually going to cover the conquest in the next video response that I do to Brandon, because he referenced it several times, specifically using words like genocide. So we'll look at that on the next video to show that that is simply not the case. But these giant misunderstandings from Brandon don't stop here. Let's take a look at Og of Bashan.
We have Og of Bashan. He was a giant king that needed a 13-foot iron bed, the last of the Repam.
Again, Rephaim.
The dimensions of that bed are cited to be physical proof of such. Again, this was taken literally.
No, this was not meant to be taken literally. And again, it really demonstrates that there was a lack of research that went into this video in terms of engaging with critical scholarship on these issues, rather than just a surface level reading of whatever English translation of the Bible that Brandon happens to have. Now, for this issue, I'm going to quote the late biblical scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser, who wrote a book, The Unseen Realm. And this is in direct reference to Og's bed. Its dimensions, 9 by 4 cubits, are precisely those of the cultic bed in the ziggurat called Etemenaki, which is the ziggurat most archaeologists identify as the Tower of Babel, referred to in the Bible. Ziggurats function as temples and divine abodes. The unusually large bed at Etemenaki was housed in the, quote, house of the bed, end quote. It was the place where the god Marduk and his divine wife, Zarpanitu, met annually for ritual lovemaking, the purpose of which was divine blessing upon the land. Interesting perspective on how the land was blessed every year. But back to the quote. Scholars have been struck by the precise correlation. It's hard not to conclude that, as with Genesis 6, 1 through 4, which we looked at earlier, so with Deuteronomy 3, also looked at that earlier, those who put the finishing touches on the Old Testament during the exile in Babylon were connecting Marduk and Og in some way. The most transparent path is, in fact, giant stature. Og is said to have been the last of the Rephaim, a term connected to the giant Anakim and other ancient giant clans in the Transjordan. Again, Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 11 and verse 20 that we looked at earlier. Marduk, like other deities in antiquity, was portrayed as superhuman in size. However, the real matrix of ideas in the mind of the biblical author may be derived from wordplay based on Babylonian mythology. Dr. Heiser added in a footnote, quote, consequently, in addition to the giantism element, a link between Og and Marduk via the matching bed dimensions may have also telegraphed the idea that Og was the inheritor and perpetuator of the Babylonian knowledge and cosmic order before the flood. Now, this was a long quote, but it was extremely detailed and extremely useful to demonstrate that Og's height is not meant to be taken literally, but rather that the biblical author is linking the Babylonian deity Marduk to Og of Bashan. And this is how an ancient Israelite or the original audience would have understood the text. They would not have interpreted this in the way that Brandon is suggesting. And so I'm in fact beginning to wonder who is the actual literalist here.
And here's the deal. For many Christians, there's so many categories, but there's a few things going on right now. There's really progressive Christians that have just left the Old Testament behind. They're like, I don't care what it says. It's metaphorical, it's allegorical, it's a warning, it's pointing us to Jesus. It doesn't need to be contended, which is disingenuous and dishonest. And we're going to talk about that in a separate.
I would 100% agree. Brandon is absolutely correct that this is both disingenuous and dishonest. And I'm looking forward to watching the video that he puts out on this.
But then you have this other group of Christians that I kind of want to, which are Christians that have no problem taking a literal worldwide flood. 40% of American Christians believe in the literal account of things like the flood and the Tower of Babel.
I've done videos on these topics previously. The Tower of Babel, I did a response to Cenk Uygur on the Flagrant podcast, who had a pretty absurd take on the Tower of Babel. And then regarding the flood, I've done several videos on this, ranging from comparative flood mythologies with stories like Atrahasis and Epic of Gilgamesh, all the way to what Brandon is referring to here with a worldwide flood. And in that video, I actually demonstrated that from the text, you can get a localized flood reading. So I will include those in the link in the description below. But as you can see here, once again, Brandon is just picking on fundamentalism. He's not engaging with the text at a high level.
But again, I'm the crazy one for reading clearly when God allows people to be owned as property for life. There's just no argument. But even outside of the fundamentalist evangelicals, there is a high percentage of people that still take these kinds of things like the Nephilim or Goliath or Og as absolute, literal, historical events being described in the Word of God.
Who? Other than the evangelical fundamentalists that were just being referred to. There's a concept, and I've heard many scholars talk about this, that there's an understanding that the biblical text is not giving you the same description that you would get if you took a video camera back in time. The biblical authors are writing in the literary styles and genres of their day, and they don't describe things in the same way that we do today. So we have to go back and determine how these stories are supposed to be interpreted. And it's not in the over-literalist way that Brandon has been describing all throughout this video.
So what does it tell you about these kinds of Christians when they cannot allow themselves to accept the other very clear, literal, horrendous things said in these same books, the same divine authorship? It suggests cherry picking to the highest degree, because again, they cannot understand how their God would be so evil, and they would know it under any other conditions except the fact it happens to be the religion they believe in. There's a different promise of a different kind of God. There's a New Testament, different words, and so they ignore this, care about this, let it go, but then they still have the audacity to argue in the way that they do when I bring up clearly in context issues with the Bible, both Old and New Testament.
Well, I think it tells you that these people are fundamentalists, because that's what fundamentalists do. They cherry pick data and they won't give it up for any amount of textual evidence. But it really appears that Brandon is doing the exact same thing. And I understand part of the reason for this is that, as he stated in his long form video, that he often gets the accusation that he's just reading the text too literal. And when he gets those type of accusations from people who are going to cherry pick the data like he's mentioning here, I would push back just as hard on them in support of Brandon as I am pushing back against the material that he put out in this video. But Brandon did claim that he brought up clearly in context issues. And as this video is demonstrated, these claims that were made in Brandon's original video just don't hold up when you actually slow down and read in proper context. And if the goal is to critique the Bible, fine, but let's do it accurately and honestly. That's the standard I'm holding here. And if you all enjoyed this, I am going to be doing further responses in future videos breaking down Brandon's full video. So be sure to check those out as well. And be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment below. And let me know what you thought of the video. Did you agree with it? Did you disagree with it? All right, everyone, I'll see you on the next one. Be sure to check out these videos that YouTube thinks you're going to like. Thanks so much.